I've been loving this series. I don't know like what I want to call this series, but where I just kind of dive into these sophomores. We talk about their rookie outlook, their year one production. We just talk about their dynasty outlook. Just kind of go through the lens of what I'm thinking about when I'm ranking these players. And today we're going to dive into my thought process behind where I'm ranking Jerry Jeudy on the dynasty rankings in the Patreon. I'm telling you guys, the best value in all of fantasy football is my Patreon. I'm not just saying that because I'm bullshitting. I'm telling you, for $5 a month, you get my dynasty rankings, one quarterback super flex. You get my redraft rankings, one quarterback super flex. My buys and sells, exclusive channels in the Discord, so you can ask me about trade advice and when you're on the clock and shit. Then in season, we're gonna have waiver wire rankings. We're gonna have rest of season rankings. We're gonna have it all on the Patreon. So make sure you go down below, check that out. Before I keep on rambling, let's go.
Thirsty, thirsty, trying to choose. I mean, I know I'm pretty cool. My nitty bag.
Jerry Jeudy, I think you guys know, I got a lot of mixed feelings about this guy. I'm not super sure how I feel about him. He's not somebody that jumps out to me as like a guy that I love, but he's also, you got to respect his game. He's a solid player. And I want to break down how I felt about him as a prospect first. And coming out of school, his analytical profile is pretty solid. He broke out at age 19 at Alabama in his second year. He put up 68 receptions for 1,300 yards and 14 touchdowns. The guy, he went out there as a sophomore and won a fucking Biletnikoff Award. I remember when he was kind of getting touted, going into his junior season, he was getting touted as like the next Julio Jones, Amari Cooper out of Alabama. Maybe he could go top 5, kind of like the Jamar Chase buzz this year. It was all about Jerry Jeudy, and we want that year 1 or year 2 breakout. He came out in year 2, age 19, went crazy like I just said, and I'm not too worried about him not breaking out in year 1 as like a 18-year-old. We want to see that, but the guy was playing with fucking Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley Jr. At that point, he's like a 24-year-old junior. That was the big knock on Calvin Ridley coming out. Not to kind of like go off on a tangent too much, but Calvin Ridley, his biggest knock was just that he was old as shit. He broke out as a freshman, but he broke out at like age 20. I don't know. He was, here's a fun fact that I found when I was researching Calvin Ridley last year. I believe he was so old as a senior in high school that he couldn't play his senior year of high school football. Like he was just too old. He was like maybe like 19, 20 as a senior in high school. I don't know what his backstory is or anything like that, but he was a grown-ass man as a junior. I don't fault Jeudy for not producing in year 1 at all. Now, where things get a little bit shaky for Jerry Jeudy is year 3, because he comes into year 3, he has all of this fucking hype. He could have gone like top 5. He was supposed to be that dude, but he comes out here and he kind of loses his footing on the wide receiver 1 chair. Him and Devontae Smith kind of split things in half. Devonta Smith led the team in yards and touchdowns. Jerry Jeudy led the team in receptions. So I'm not saying that Jerry Jeudy was the wide receiver 2 there. I think a lot of Devonta Smith truthers are like, oh, Devonta Smith was the wide receiver 1 that year. It was more like 1A, 1B, and I couldn't really tell you who was 1A or 1B, but it's just a little bit of a blemish on his profile, if you will. But here's the thing. Let's look into the analytics a little bit more. Let's see what that actually looks like on paper. First up, we have his receiving yards per team pass attempt. He looks pretty good in this stat. He finishes above the red dot threshold in 2 out of 3 years with a sophomore breakout. Now, that red dot threshold is going to be the average for a top 24 wide receiver. We want to see him break that red dot in as many years as he can. 2 out of 3 is pretty good. And in weighted dominator rating, he whiffs pretty bad. That's going to be, like the normal dominator rating, but it's going to be, instead of 50-50 with yards and touchdowns, it's going to be 80-20 with yards and touchdowns. Touchdowns are kind of like random. You still want to give them some respect, but you don't want to overcompensate for them in your statistic, whatever you want to call it. So he comes out here, he barely even hits that year 2 threshold, but we'll give him that Alabama boost. He looks okay, but he doesn't look great. His analytical profile is good, but not great is what I would say, which then brings us to the combine. He comes in at a wiry 6'1", 193. That's a thin boy. You know what I mean? That's not a thick boy. That's a thin boy. We're talking about a guy who kind of looks just like Calvin Ridley. He's undersized. He's straight line, speedster kind of guy. He lacks burst. And this is good, but it's also really scary because we want alpha wide receivers. Alpha wide receivers, you can pull a name out of a hat. Alshon Jeffrey, Des Bryant, Devontae Adams, Michael Thomas, D-Hop, whoever you want to say. But when it comes to that build of 6'1", 193 route runner type style like Jeudy, it's Calvin Ridley and it's Stephon Diggs, and then that's end of list. That's all you got as his ceiling comp. So kind of shrinks that moving target for him when we're talking about these ceiling type scenarios. And he gets drafted 15th overall to the Broncos. So to recap his prospect profile, he gets first round draft capital, has a nuclear sophomore breakout, hits some thresholds I look for, wasn't super pretty in weighted dominator rating, but he looked pretty good in receiving yards per team pass attempt. And he has that route runner type archetype. Now the downsides of his profile though, he's a non-alpha with a disappointing year 3. He's not some bulletproof type prospect. He lacks the size. He lacks the consistent like just dominance in college. So he's not an elite prospect to me. He's good, not great. He would be my wide receiver 3 in this class. So it would go Jamar Chase, then it'd go Rashad Bateman, then it would go Jerry Jeudy for me. He'd be my wide receiver 3 this year as like a late first, early second kind of guy, which then brings us to year 1. And on the surface, Jeudy had a bad rookie season. And I just want to get one fucking thing out of the way. I don't give a fuck about drops. I don't care. I will shit on Jeudy's rookie season in a second. But if you're going to sit here and call him out for drops, that's the worst thing possible. Drops, they don't matter. Matt Harmon, one of the gurus of wide receivers, he has a sick article where he talks about drops. They don't matter. The whole point is that they're a negativity bias kind of thing going on where it looks bad. It looks ugly. So it really registers. At the end of the day, Jeudy had 8 drops. He played 16 games. He dropped 8 passes. That's not a big deal at all. Drops aren't sticky year to year. They go away. I can't name a wide receiver off the top of my head where they dropped the ball so many times that it led to them being shit. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I've never seen a wide receiver who was, like Amari Cooper. I think that he had the drops early in his career. If you're talented, you're talented. It doesn't matter if you drop the football. It's something you can work on. It's a focus thing. It's a nerve thing. It's not like a raw talent thing. It's not the fucking yips. You'll get over it. It's not a big deal. So anybody that's going to come out here and say, I don't like Jeudy because he drops the football, or I don't like Deontay Johnson because he drops the football, fade that noise is all I got to say about that. But Jerry Jeudy comes out here in year 1 on the Broncos. He puts up 52 receptions for 856 yards and 3 touchdowns in 16 games. But let's add some context. The guy was thrown to the wolves in year 1. He had Drew Lock, he had Jeff Driscoll, Brett Ripien, Kendall Hinton at QB one game. That was like the COVID game where the whole quarterback room got fucked. So we're talking horrific quarterback play across the board. And it showed. His target accuracy was 107th in the league. Outside of the top 100 wide receivers, that's how bad his target accuracy was. And his quarterbacks really held him back last year, especially when you consider his ADOT. Now, I think that he would have started out the year in the slot, but Cortland Sutton, he got hurt, so it moved Jeudy to the outside. It might have brought KJ Hamler on the inside. I'm not sure. But because of that, Jeudy was operating down the field a lot. And when you have shitty QBs that can't throw accurately, we're seeing a lot of Jerry Jeudy run a route, get open, throw me the damn ball, and it's sailing over his damn head. So that's going to be what hurts him. That's why he doesn't have a lot of receptions. That's why he had 113 targets, but only 52 catches. Now, I want to say 21.2% target share with 113 targets is really impressive, though. 113 targets, it ranks 15th out of 302 rookies since 2007 that I have in my database, ahead of studs like Metcalf, Ridley, D-Hop. So it's pretty solid. And what that shows is he's getting open. He's out there, he's running routes, he's getting open. And the problem is that at the top of the route, the boy behind center is just tossing the ball elsewhere. Especially, like I said, when you're operating 13.6 yards down the field on average, having a quarterback throw to the hashes, throw deep down the field, you're really depending on your quarterback play. So I can give him a little bit of a pass. And the thing is, we want to key in on him getting open because that's going to be, isolated from the quarterback play. He pretty much got open with ease. He looked really good in reception perception. He beat man coverage 75% of the time, which is in the 87th percentile. Matt Harmon in his blurb, I always like to read what he says about these players. He says the archive data would tell us that it would be a true upset if a player like that doesn't have a breakout season at some point in his NFL career. Later on, he calls him a stud route runner. So he has that build where Matt Harmon's talking him up as one of these elite route runners, and that's what we thought he was going to be out of school. So that all holds true. And I will say on paper, I like Jeudy's rookie season production. What's a little more sobering, though, is going to be his sophomore comps. I always like to dig into these sophomore comps to go into the database. We find all this shit out. The thing is, Jeudy's red flag for me is his 64.8 receiving grade per PFF. We know his points per game is going to hold him down in these comps, but if he's super talented, he's getting open, etc., his receiving grade would have been better. He went out there, he had a 64.8 receiving grade. That's not good. I went over this with Ayuk. Players' receiving grades as rookies really matter. The guys with 80 plus their rookie year, they hit at a 100% hit rate. If Jeudy was cooking dudes, he would have graded out much better, like McLaurin in his rookie year. He graded out as like an 86 receiving grade. So, maybe Jeudy got dinged for the drops, but I don't see him getting dinged that much for the drops. There had to be something on tape. He's just not out there looking super dominant. And because of this, his sophomore comps, they're not great. And just to be clear with these sophomore comps, I take their PFF grade, their points per game, and their breakout finder wide receiver model grade into account. So that takes in like production, takes in his film grade, and takes in what he looked like as a prospect. Takes that all into account and it spits out this list. I'm gonna put it on the screen in a second here. And we're looking at a pretty mixed bag. We're looking at like a ceiling of a D-Hop, but I think the data is telling us that he's more like a Robert Woods, a Mike Wallace, a Tyler Boyd, a Will Fuller, I think is another good one. And I want to say I kept the face planners in there because Jerry Jeudy from year 1 to year 2, he had -11 in ADP. So he was on the fringes of being a face planner. So I left all of them in there because I think that's fair. And the other thing is he has a pretty shaky floor. He's got guys like Sterling Shepard and Kendall Wright in there. And I think realistically, if you put a gun to my head, what I think Jerry Jeudy is at the NFL level, like his baseline outcome, not his ceiling, just what I think he's going to be. I think he's more of a 1B kind of guy, a guy who maybe gets 1 or 2 top 12 seasons, racks up a bunch of top 24 seasons. And I think he's kind of like a Tyler Lockett, like a specialist at route running. And I think Tyler Lockett, that's a good outcome. And not everyone's going to go out there and be Calvin Ridley. And I think it's tough to project him to be Calvin Ridley when we've only seen Calvin Ridley and Diggs do that archetype where they're undersized, but they're really sick route runners. And then on the flip side of that, it's hard for me to say that he's going to be DeAndre Hopkins. That's like the ceiling of this list. D-Hop's a guy who's this big, hulking alpha. That's not Jeudy's game. So it's a little bit tougher for me when he's not an alpha to project him for that top 5 type upside. Now let's look at his outlook moving forward a little bit more micro. Let's look at what he's going to be looking at in Denver, and he's going to be swimming upstream. He's in a wide receiver room with an alpha wide receiver in Courtland Sutton, a guy that I really like. Sutton's already shown that he can be a top wide receiver in the NFL. I love Jeudy, but he has not shown that yet. Sutton is in the last year of his deal though, so I will say, if you want to kind of hit this as like a positive for Jeudy, I think Sutton's great. He might hold him back a little bit in 2021. He might hold back Jeudy, but long-term, Sutton's not locked in past this year, so he could go sign elsewhere. At least in 2021, I think Judy's going to be scrapping for targets with Sutton, and you're going to have Teddy Bridgewater throwing the ball. I think that we've seen the last of Drew Lock at this point. It's going to be an anemic offense. They're not going to score a lot of points, but what I will say, Teddy Bridgewater, he supported 3 top 25 wide receivers last year, back end top 24 guys, and maybe he could do the same with Sutton and Jeudy. Right now, I have Jeudy as my wide receiver 36 in redraft as like a back end wide receiver 3, but I think at his ceiling, he can probably post fringe top 24 numbers. And I think that's fair. Now, I will add that if they add Aaron Rodgers, if Aaron Rodgers decides, I'm fucking done with the California shit, I'm done with the Jeopardy shit, I'm going to come out here and actually play ball, then at that point, I'm interested in Jeudy in terms of like 2021. But here's the thing. I don't really weigh situation a lot, especially for these younger wide receivers. When we have plenty of years left of their prime, I don't really care too much about their situation. But when we're talking about like a Keenan Allen, I really do care because I know he only has 1 or 2 years left. Same with like D-Hop. But these young players, second year players, who knows? Maybe they go out there, they trade for Aaron Rodgers. Maybe they just sort of fucking stumble into a top 3 pick next year. Maybe they trade up, So you never really know. So I'm not going to use the situation against him. But when we're talking about Jeudy moving forward, I like to just sort of zoom in on the talent. And what it comes down to is I think that his size limits his ceiling to me. That's kind of just what it boils down to. Again, I think he's a great football player. I think he's a stud route runner. I just struggle to see a top 5 type ceiling. Because when we're talking about wide receiver 2s, guys that are like fringe top 12 guys, they're super replaceable. I've done videos on this in the past. But guys that don't finish as like a top 5 difference-making wide receiver, they're all replaceable. Like the guy, I think wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 36, I remember the stat. Wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 36 had the same gap in points per game between wide receiver 12 and I think wide receiver 6. It's insane. The guys that score in that range, they're all really replaceable. So it's hard to, pay up in a startup draft for guys that I think project more as, 12 to 24 guys and guys that can have that top 5 type ceiling. And like I've said throughout this entire video, he can be Calvin Ridley. He can be Stephon Diggs, but those are literally 2 absolute best case scenarios. When we're talking about guys like a Claypool, I like Claypool. He can be Michael Thomas, AJ Brown, Des Bryant, DeAndre Hopkins. You can just go back and go back and go back and you can find Julio Jones. You can find Calvin Johnson. Guys that look that part, plentiful. But when we're talking about like Calvin Ridley, Stephon Diggs, that's kind of it when it comes to that like archetype. With that being said, Jeudy is my 704 as my wide receiver 28 in his ADP according to @AdicoFF, a guy that I love on Twitter. He has like an ADP document. He tracks ADP from Sleeper. He's going off the word of the 612 as the wide receiver 22. So I have 6 wide receivers ahead of him than consensus, but I'm like 4 picks below consensus on him. So for me, he's a super strong hold. I want to see it through. And I think that these year 2 wide receivers, when they have that promising year 1 and they didn't face plant and they have the profile like a Jeudy, you want to hold on for dear life because we know these year 2 wide receivers can go nuclear. And Jeudy has that in his range of outcomes. I'm just not as sure as other people. There's guys out there that are super firm on Jeudy. And the reason I don't have many dynasty leagues is because there's somebody out there that wants to bet more than I am on Jeudy. And here's the thing I will say. Like I said, he's a hold for me. I'm not going to go out there and sell him. I think a lot of you guys might have watched this video and expect me to say, like, go sell Jeudy. I like him. I just don't love him. But here's the thing. His keep trade cut price is getting a little bit out of control right now. He's at, like, wide receiver 20. And I'd sell for his market price on keep trade cut. Just hear me out for a second. I would sell the guys that are in the same range as him. I'm going to put on the screen right now. I would sell him for Keenan Allen, Mike Evans, Sutton, Claypool. I would also even sell him for Rashad Bateman and some change in return. I have Bateman ahead of Jeudy in the dynasty rankings I know it's a little bit of a hot take, but if I could get any of those wide receivers in return, I would. But I'm also just cool with holding him and seeing what happens. That's it for today. DeAndre Swift video coming tomorrow. Also, let me know down below in the comments. Let me know what sophomore I should cover next. And I also, I love doing these sophomore videos, but let me know if I should start shifting to like a redraft lens, because we're getting into the deep summer now. Do you guys want to still see like a dynasty lens? Like I just did like this whole ass breakdown of Jeudy, what I think about him from a dynasty perspective, or should I kind of tilt it more into redraft because that's kind of the season we're getting into now? I'm still cool with doing either way. Just thought I'd ask you guys that. As always, the thought process behind all of these rankings looks something like this that I do, you know, just taking like 12 plus hours out of my like weekend. I pretty much set one weekend aside a month and I update these rankings monthly. So if you want to get in on these rankings, get the best deal in fantasy football, go down below. Check out the Patreon for $5 a month. You can get my rankings or Superflex or 1QB. There's tiers across the fucking board. Redraft rankings on top of that. The exclusive parts of the Discord. So there's a lot of cool stuff you get in there. And on top of that, if you don't really want to pay anything, if you don't want to do any of that, that's cool too. Make sure you go down below. Join the Discord. That's kind of where we're housing this whole community. I always say this on the channel. I ride for you guys. You guys ride for me. So I really want to have all of you guys in one spot so we can talk, we can connect, we can talk about fantasy teams. We do mock drafts on there, underdog drafts on there. So if you want to get involved in this community, go down below in the description. Just join the Discord. And with that being said, follow me at @RonStore_ on Twitter. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. We'll see. Maybe tomorrow. I'll see if I can get that video out. But I'll see you guys in the next one.
I got the juice, I got the juice.
10 old Chatham's on. Foolies glad I'm home. Even my haters kinda glad I'm on. Rest in peace to my vagabond. Rapper, song, singer, suspended, subpoenaed for misdemeanors. Dreamer, held back asses, Loki still a zen. And I still shake a boat.